Here lately, I've had a lot of people message me and ask me about primering. A lot of people have said that their models have like this gritty appearance and they just doesn't look right. Some people are telling me that the paint won't stick. Or they said that the details are just very faint and have disappeared. So today I've decided to make a shorter video about how I primer, the kind of primers to use, the do's and the don'ts, all that good stuff to help you make your model look good, better, best. But first, let's talk about today's sponsor. There isn't one. All kidding aside, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the primers out there and some that I use. So first and foremost, here are the primers that I currently use. There are different primers out there, but I have been using these for a couple of years now, and I am getting super good results from them. So first off, the primer here, this Vallejo primer comes in different colors, and this is really good to use through your airbrush. You can thin this stuff out to make it go through the airbrush a little better. However, I recommend putting in several thin coats, and that'll help out tremendously. But these two primers right here are the ones that I use the most. The gray primer right here is really good for highly detailed models such as miniatures and faces and portraits and just anything with any high detail. And the black here, I use a lot of that on any time that I'm going to use dark base coats or any type of cover-ups that I need, something that I'm going to apply a dark color on, like this Wolverine trousers right here that on a model from Zez Studios that I am currently working on. And I'm going to give this a good, nice, darker color. It keeps the colors dark, not faint, and looks like that it's going to just take like tons of the detail away or anything like that. So this is what I use for darker base colors. Okay, that's all you need to know. That's the end of the video. No, I'm just kidding, guys. So here's a couple of things that I do, a couple of pointers for you. That way you get the best result out of your model. That way you get paint to stick. That way it just looks better. Of course, one of the first things you want to do before you add any primer to your model is to make sure that all of your sanding is complete and make sure any dust is removed away from the model. That means using something like a little makeup brush. I get a couple of those from the dollar store or from Walmart or whatever like that. And I keep those on hand so I can actually remove some of that dust by brushing that off of there. I also have like a little stiff brush. That way it gets in the cracks and crevices of all the detail areas, and that also helps it get rid of all the dust. So I always have to plug this G tool here because this little polisher right here helps smooth out a lot of those areas that can have like tracks from larger sandpaper or something like that nature. And this helps get those areas smooth. So when you add the primer, it's all hidden. Now, one thing to know that we're talking about today are models such as statues, figurines, and miniatures. Cosplay is a little different. So one of the things I don't use on my models or like miniatures is high build primer. This stuff will gum up sandpaper. It's really good for deep cracks and crevices, but if you are using like high details, I suggest avoiding this because it can hide those details. So one of the first things that people do forget when using one of these rattle can primers is making sure this stuff is shaken up really, really, really well. And yes, that means shaking that thing for a good solid 5 or 6 minutes, sometimes even longer than that. If you spray it straight out of the can, it's going to spider web everywhere. It's not going to adhere very well, and it's just going to completely mess up your model to where you have to wind up taking the primer back off or doing even more sanding or something like that. So when I actually apply the first layer of primer, what I typically do is I apply a light mist. That way it will actually kind of let me know whether it's going to bond to the model before I start putting a lot of primer on it. Now, if something happens to where it doesn't really bond to the model, then you might have something like some grease from your fingers, some type of oils, or something of that nature on the model that you need to get rid of. Now, some people will wipe down their model with IPA or some type of degreaser or whatever like that before they apply the first layer of primer. I don't do that because I do not want any type of residue on that model, no matter what is on there can affect it. So the first thing that I do is after I sand it, I get all the dust off, and then I apply that first mist layer on the model. And then once that looks like it's good and you're getting good coverage, the primer's coming out of the can very well, it's adhering to the model, then I'll go in and I'll add my first complete layer. Usually after you lay down the first layer, you'll be able to notice if you have to go back in and do any extra sanding, if something's very noticeable that you need to take out of the model before you go any further. If you start adding extra layers, it's just going to cause that much issues to where you just gonna have to wind up sanding it off anyway. So one other thing to take into consideration, if you're thinking that the more you apply it, the more layers and stuff that'll cover up little scuff marks and everything, trust me, it will not. It will actually start to run on you. You'll have to wind up sanding it anyway. So after that first layer, generally if you have some scuff marks that you feel like you need to sand or polish to get out of the model, stop what you're doing right there and then go back and do your sanding, and then add another little small layer of primer onto the model. But don't forget to brush off all that dust after you do the sanding. Now, if you're using a primer such as this right here for the airbrush, some of these primers can spray out of the bottle. However, I do still like to add just a little bit of thinner to them or a little bit of water. It helps to get through the airbrush a little bit better. That way it doesn't spit and spatter all over your model, and just apply thin layers. That's all you got to do. So one extra tip that you can use if you are sanding a large area such as a base, a helmet, or whatever it is, your final sanding should be done with something like a very fine sandpaper. I like to use steel wool. That really gets a really good smooth finish to it and takes those just surface scratches right out. No, not a Brillo pad, steel wool. And God's sakes, whatever you do, man, let the primer dry in between coats. Don't be putting tons of it on there when it's wet. It's either going to run on you, it's just going to be a mess. Don't do it. Oh my God, and one other thing that people tend to do is when they get done primering, they put the paint on right away. Don't do that. Let it dry. I typically let my primer dry for 24 hours. Everybody's different, but make sure it's dry before you add any paint to it. The one other thing that I do is when I use this rattle can primer, I spray it outside. I don't spray it indoors. I don't use a paint booth or anything. This stuff right here can really get nasty. A lot of overspray. Just don't do it. Spray it in a well-ventilated room, well-ventilated area, or outside. Otherwise, you're going to get paint on everything. But for this stuff right here, I actually have a spray booth behind me that I'll spray this in. It's pretty okay. My PSI is down to like 30, 35, so it's not just gonna have a bunch of overspray all over my models, all over my room, all over me. Just make sure you're using proper PPE, mask, respirator, all that good stuff, and you should be good. And remember, in between layers that you're primering, make sure to go back over them with some type of brush like these makeup brushes here to get that dust off. There will be some overspray on there, and you don't want to paint over that because you will get that kind of gritty effect to your primer. And don't forget that stiff brush to get into the tiniest crevices and detailed areas of the model. You want it to look good, not grainy. Did I say grainy or granny? And then the last thing is to make sure you dry fit your model again after you've primered it. You may have that extra layer of paint that prevents it from fitting into the keys. Make sure to go back and double check that before you add any paint to the model. All right, so once you are done, you got everything primered, everything looks great, you have no more sanding, all of your stuff is complete. It is now time to add paint to your model. And by taking the extra time and effort into making sure that your primer is on correctly, make sure that you're using good primer, your paint is going to look that much better on there. So I hope this helped you out, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into the video. I know it's probably a shorter video, but I kind of wanted to go over my process real quick for anybody who may need it. And I hope it helps you out. All right, that is it, everyone. Stay safe out there. Get out and create something. Print, prep, paint, repeat. And until the next video or the next tutorial or the next live stream, we'll see you.